The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light across the sprawling plantation in Savannah, Georgia. The winds were eerily quiet that evening, the usual hum of the crickets muted as if they too were holding their breath. In the distance, the faint glow of the cabin windows flickered, casting shadows on the grounds where Clara had worked tirelessly for years. But tonight Clara was not just another tired slave. Tonight she was something else, an escapee. Inside her small cabin, Clara's hands moved swiftly, carefully, as she prepared to make the decision that would change her life forever. The weight of the chains around her heart had been unbearable for far too long. Her soul had been bound in a way that even the physical chains of slavery could not replicate. For years, she had lived under the constant threat of brutality, under the crushing weight of the overseer's whip, and under the suffocating silence of broken dreams. But no more. Clara knew tonight was the night she would be free. The cabin door clicked shut, and Clara, for the first time in years, was not worried about being caught. This time, there was no turning back. Clara had been born into slavery on the sprawling plantation outside Savannah, raised to serve without question, without hope. From the moment she could walk, Clara had been placed into the fields, working the crops that fed the family who owned the land and the overseers who enforced their cruelty. She had seen generations of men and women come and go, each one quietly enduring the same horrors. But none of them had the courage to escape. They had been too afraid of the unknown, too afraid of what lay beyond the gates. Clara had heard the whispers of the freedom seekers, of the underground routes that led north. She had heard the old stories of people who vanished into the night, people who made it to freedom. It was in the quiet moments, the brief seconds of rest, that Clara allowed herself to dream. But dreaming was dangerous. Dreams were fragile, easily crushed under the weight of reality. Yet tonight, Clara was not just dreaming. She was acting. Clara's cabin was small, barely more than a room with a thin cot and a small fire pit. Yet it was the only space she had ever known as her own. She glanced around one last time, her gaze lingering on the few possessions she had accumulated over the years. A small cloth doll her mother had made, a tin cup she'd used for water, and a faded piece of cloth that had once been a family heirloom. It had all been left behind by the whims of the masters, who had thought nothing of breaking their slaves' spirits. But Clara's spirit had not been broken. It had only been hidden, waiting. And now, as the hours passed, she could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. The plan was simple: slip past the guards, unlock the gate, and disappear into the night. Once she was beyond the gates, the fields would swallow her up, and the woods would lead her north. She had memorized the routes, observed the guards' habits, and listened to the stories of those who had escaped before her. Clara would not be like the others who had been caught. She was different. She was determined. As the night deepened, Clara quietly unlatched the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Inside she kept a few essentials: food, water, a blanket, and a small knife for protection. She had gathered these supplies over the past few weeks, waiting for the right moment. Tonight was that moment. She took a deep breath, her heart racing with excitement and fear. Everything she had known, everything she had lived for, was tied to the plantation. But it was time to sever those ties. The chains that had held her for so long were about to be broken. Before she left, Clara went to the door and paused. She reached for the key that would unlock the cabin, but then stopped. Instead, she turned to the window, the faint light of the moon filtering through the cracked shutters. There, in the distance, she could see the outline of the overseer's house, their eyes always watching, always waiting. But not tonight. Tonight, Clara would be the one who chose. With a single motion, Clara locked the door behind her, turning the key and slipping it into her pocket. She took one last look around the cabin, the place she had once called home, and stepped outside into the cold, silent night. The wind carried a chill that made her shiver, but she moved forward, determined. The moon was high above as Clara moved silently through the plantation grounds, her feet light against the grass. The houses of the other slaves were dark, the air thick with the sound of sleep. But Clara knew better than to look back. She had made her decision. As she neared the fields, the scent of the freshly tilled earth filled her senses, and the sound of distant crickets seemed to echo in the vast expanse of night. The gates were in sight now, just ahead. She could almost hear the sound of them opening, the sound of freedom. But as she neared the gate, Clara heard footsteps behind her. Her heart stopped for a moment. She had known this would happen. It was too quiet, too still. The guards, she had forgotten them. They had been watching. They always watched. Clara's breath quickened as she darted into the shadows, pressing herself against the edge of the cotton fields. She could see the silhouette of the guard moving along the perimeter, his lantern swinging in the darkness. Clara held her breath, praying that the shadows would hide her. For a moment she thought she had been seen. But then the guard moved on, and Clara allowed herself to exhale slowly. She had made it this far. The gate was only a few steps away now. The lock clicked open, a soft sound that seemed to echo in the night. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she slipped through the gate, the cool air hitting her face. She was free. She was out, but there was no time to rejoice. Clara had to move quickly. The road ahead was still long, and there was no telling how much time she had before someone realized she was gone. The moon was high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow across the darkened plantation. The sounds of the night were still, unnervingly so. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts as she moved swiftly through the tall grass, keeping low to the ground. The plantation ground stretched endlessly in front of her, the sprawling fields of cotton and tobacco seeming to go on forever. Each step took her farther from the life she had known, further into the unknown. She knew the guards were on rotation, their patrols predictable. But tonight she couldn't afford to be seen. The gate was her goal. If she could make it there, she would be free. Freedom had always seemed like a distant dream, an impossible idea. But now, with the cold air on her skin and the adrenaline coursing through her veins, it felt real. It felt like something she could almost touch. Her eyes scanned the horizon. There, just ahead, the silhouette of the wooden gate that separated the slaves from the world beyond. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She was so close now she could almost feel the weight of the chains lifting from her shoulders. But the path was still long, and danger was everywhere. Clara's steps were quick and light, but her mind was heavy with doubt. It wasn't that she was afraid of the dark. The night had always felt like her only ally. It was the fear of being caught, of her freedom slipping away before she even had a chance to claim it. She had always lived under the shadow of her master's house, always feared the overseers, and now the prospect of escape brought both hope and terror. The faint crunch of footsteps echoed through the night. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself into the tall grass, lying as still as she could, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound of the footsteps grew closer, and Clara could hear the soft rustle of the guard's uniform, the flicker of his lantern in the distance. She was in the open now. There was nowhere to hide except the shadowed edge of the cotton field. The guard's lantern light cut through the darkness like a blade, moving steadily toward her. Clara's mind raced. What if he sees me? What if I don't make it? But the risk was greater if she stayed still. Her legs trembled with fear, but she forced herself to move. Slowly, deliberately, she crouched down and crawled toward the farthest corner of the field, keeping her body low to the ground. She felt the soft earth beneath her hands, the sting of grass against her skin. She could hear the guard's footsteps grow louder, the lantern swinging as he moved along the path. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and every instinct told her to run, but that would be the moment he would see her. Patience, Clara, patience, she reminded herself. She stayed low, kept quiet, and waited for the guard to pass. The lantern light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the field. The guard was only a few paces away now, the swish of his boots on the ground the only sound in the silence. Clara could hear the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The guard's face was obscured by the distance, but she could see his steady pace as he moved past her, unaware of her presence in the shadows. It was close. Too close. Clara held her breath, praying that the guard would not stop. If he did, if he so much as glanced in her direction, all of her carefully laid plans would fall apart. And then, just like that, the guard passed. His lantern light moved further along, leaving Clara hidden in the dark. Clara exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over her. She didn't dare move yet. It was not safe. The guard had passed, but she couldn't let her guard down. The escape was still far from over. But it was a victory, a small one, and it fueled her determination. She had to keep going. As Clara continued to crawl through the field, The heavy weight of the plantation house faded into the distance behind her. The oppressive walls, the harsh overseers, the cracked whips, they were no longer her reality. It was all behind her now. Ahead, the gate loomed, the final obstacle standing between her and freedom. The gate was large, iron, and sturdy, the kind of barrier built to keep people like Clara inside. It was also the gate that had held her captive for years, the boundary she had never been allowed to cross. But tonight the gate would not stop her. Clara had spent countless hours watching it, studying the guards who guarded it, learning the timings, and now it was time to face it. She reached the base of the gate and immediately crouched low, peeking through the iron bars. There was a small gap in the side, just large enough for her to slip through. Clara's pulse quickened. She could do this. She could escape. The lock on the gate was old, worn from years of use, but still strong. Clara had watched the key holder for weeks, noting the exact time he left the key inside the guardhouse. She had learned that there was a small window of time in the early hours of the morning when the key was left unattended, when the guards were distracted. It was that window she had been waiting for. She reached into her pocket, her hands shaking, and pulled out a small piece of metal she had found days ago, one of the many tools left behind by previous slaves. She had used it to practice picking locks, and now it was her only hope. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, each click of the mechanism a reminder of how much was at stake. With each passing moment, the possibility of freedom became more real. Clara took a deep breath and, with a final twist, the lock gave way. The gate creaked open. Clara slipped through the gate as quietly as she could, her heart hammering in her chest. She was on the other side. The world outside the plantation stretched ahead. And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to feel the exhilaration of freedom. But there was no time to savor the victory. The journey had only just begun. The land beyond the plantation was unfamiliar, and the dangers were many. The night was her ally, but it was also treacherous. She had no idea where to go next, no map to guide her, but she knew one thing: she could not stop. Not now. She was free, and the world beyond the plantation held the possibility of everything she had ever dreamed of, but she was not yet safe. The cool night. Air kissed Clara's skin as she stepped beyond the plantation's iron gate, her heart pounding with both excitement and fear. She had made it through the first hurdle, but the road ahead was filled with the unknown. The trees that lined the edge of the plantation appeared to stretch on endlessly, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long shadows across the ground. The plantation house, once towering behind her, was now just a distant silhouette against the moonlit sky. For a moment, Clara stood still, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, the faint hum of the world beyond. It was a sound she had never truly heard before, not like this. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of possibility. But beneath that, Clara could still feel the weight of everything she had left behind, the only life she had ever known, the people she loved, and the constant threat of being discovered. Her feet, bare and worn from the long days of labor, carried her forward. The air was thick with the scent of earth, dew, and something she had never smelled before: freedom. Clara had traveled far from the plantation, her feet sore from the miles she had covered, when she finally paused to catch her breath near a creek. The water flowed quickly, its gurgle soft but distinct against the otherwise silent woods. She crouched down, cupping her hands to drink the cool, fresh water. It tasted different, cleaner, purer than the water she had been given at the plantation. Her moment of peace was short-lived. From a distance, Clara heard the unmistakable sound of hooves against the ground, faint at first, but growing louder. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood up quickly, panic surging through her. She knew there were patrols out tonight, and the thought that she might be caught so close to freedom made her blood run cold. The sound of the hooves grew louder, now accompanied by the creak of a wagon. Clara darted behind a thick cluster of trees, holding her breath, trying to make herself as small and silent as possible. She pressed herself against the bark, every muscle in her body tensed. Through the gaps in the branches, she could see two men on horseback, their lanterns casting long shadows. They were scanning the ground, clearly searching for something, or someone. The horses passed by, their riders' faces illuminated briefly by the lantern light. Clara remained still, her body trembling, until the sounds of hooves and wagon wheels faded into the distance. She exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. The close call had shaken her, but it also strengthened her resolve. She had survived one obstacle, but there would be more. The path to freedom was never easy, and she would have to be ready for whatever came next. The night grew darker, and Clara continued her journey through the woods, now with even more caution. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the shadows grew deeper, making it harder to navigate. The freedom she had fought for was just beyond her reach, but she wasn't yet safe. The plantation was behind her, but the wilderness was vast and unfamiliar. For hours, Clara walked through the forest, her thoughts scattered as she tried to keep her bearings. She had learned some of the terrain from the old folks who worked the fields alongside her, but she had never ventured this far from the plantation. The thought of being caught out here, alone in the wilderness, filled her with dread. At times, the path ahead seemed to disappear, swallowed by the thick undergrowth and gnarled roots. Clara stumbled several times, once nearly falling into a hidden pit of mud, but she caught herself just in time. She knew she had to keep moving. If she stopped now, she risked being caught. But there was a decision she needed to make. Ahead, she saw the faint glow of a distant light through the trees, a small cabin, tucked away in a hollow. It was too much of a risk. She had heard stories of others who had sought refuge with people they thought they could trust, only to be betrayed to the slave catchers. But if she didn't take the chance, if she didn't seek help soon, she would be forced to face the wilderness alone. Clara hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. The night was her ally, but it could also betray her. She needed shelter. The light in the distance was her only hope. Clara approached the cabin cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. The light was faint now, almost extinguished, but it was still visible. She approached the small wooden door, which had a simple iron latch. She paused and listened, her breath caught in her throat. There was no sound from inside, no movement. Taking a deep breath, Clara knocked lightly on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. She waited. Her mind raced, her thoughts running wild. What if no one answered? What if she had made a mistake? After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her face wrinkled with age, but her eyes sharp and alert. Clara could see the weariness in her eyes, but also a kindness, a recognition of the struggle in Clara's own. "I've been waiting for you," the woman said, her voice soft yet steady. "Come in, child. You're safe here, for now." Clara stepped inside, grateful for the warmth and shelter of the small cabin. The woman led her to a small bed by the hearth, where a fire crackled softly. She offered Clara a cup of warm tea, which Clara drank gratefully, feeling the warmth seep through her body. As Clara settled by the fire, she looked around the cabin. It was humble but peaceful. There were no signs of the brutality she had left behind, no overseers or masters to threaten her. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. But the safety was temporary. The woman had warned her that the night would not last forever, and neither would this peace. The risk of being discovered was still very real. The next morning, the woman would guide Clara further along the path to freedom. But tonight, for the first time since her escape, Clara allowed herself to close her eyes and sleep, just a little, with the hope of freedom in her heart. The cabin was quiet when Clara awoke, the early morning light creeping in through the small window above her bed. She stretched her limbs, stiff from the hard ground and the makeshift bed, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace. The warmth of the fire still lingered in the air, and the woman who had taken her in had already started a small breakfast of cornbread and beans. Clara's stomach rumbled in response, the hunger she had carried for days momentarily forgotten. The woman, whose name was Margaret, had told Clara the night before that she could not stay long. The sound of distant horses could already be heard, and it was clear that the authorities were still scouring the area for runaways. The plantations around Savannah were vast, and escape was never truly without risk. But Clara felt a flicker of hope in her chest. She had made it this far, and though her journey had only just begun, she wasn't going back. "Not now, not ever. Breakfast is ready," Margaret called gently, her voice warm and inviting. Clara rose, grateful for the brief respite. She had been so focused on the fear of being caught that she hadn't allowed herself to truly rest. Now, with food in her stomach, she was ready to face whatever came next. After they ate, Margaret led Clara outside, where the day was beginning to break. The forest around the cabin was dense, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. The morning was still and quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. It was a peaceful scene, but Clara knew better than to let her guard down. There was no time for peace, not yet. Margaret handed Clara a small bundle of supplies, a blanket, some dried food, and a small knife for protection. "You'll need to keep moving. The more you stay in one place, the more likely it is they'll find you," she said, her voice filled with the quiet urgency of someone who knew the harsh realities of the world. Clara nodded. "Thank you," she said, her throat tight with emotion. Margaret had risked everything to help her, and Clara knew she couldn't repay the kindness. But she would do what she could, even if it was just making sure she reached freedom. Margaret led Clara along a narrow trail that wound through the forest, guiding her with a steady pace. They moved in silence, Clara's mind still racing with everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. She had crossed the gate, slipped past the guards, and made it into the woods. But now, in the quiet of the forest, the reality of what she had done was beginning to settle in. She was alone. She was free, but that freedom came with a price. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what dangers awaited her in the wild. Margaret had said the safest path was to head west, toward the small creek that led toward the river. From there were boats that could carry her north, to the land where freedom awaited. But that path was treacherous. There were bounty hunters in the area, men who made their living off the capture of runaway slaves. Every step was a gamble. As they walked, Clara kept her eyes fixed ahead, her mind focused on the task at hand. There was no time to be scared. She had made the decision to leave, and there was no turning back. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only path she had. Just as Clara and Margaret were nearing the creek, the sound of hooves reached Clara's ears. The soft clip-clop of horses on the trail. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced around nervously, looking for a place to hide. The trail ahead had no cover, and behind them was an open field. They were exposed. "Quick, over here!" Margaret whispered urgently, pulling Clara off the path and into a thicket of thick brush. Clara dropped to her knees, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel her pulse in her ears, the fear gripping her chest. They huddled low, waiting for the riders to pass. The sound of the horses grew louder, and Clara dared not move. She could feel the damp earth against her palms, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had escaped the overseers and the guards, but now, the reality of what she was running from, what she was truly risking, became painfully clear. Through the thicket, Clara watched as two riders appeared, their silhouettes sharp against the soft morning light. They were bounty hunters, their faces set in grim determination as they scanned the area. The horses snorted and shifted nervously, their riders' eyes darting to every corner of the forest. Clara could feel her heart thundering in her chest, and her breath came faster. The riders didn't see them. After a long moment, the horses moved on, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance. Margaret exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing. "That was too close," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Clara couldn't speak for a moment. She was too shaken by the close encounter. But Margaret was already pulling her to her feet. "We don't have much time," she said firmly. "We need to keep moving," Clara nodded, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. The hunters were close, but they had survived. For now, they were safe. By midday, the two women arrived at the creek Margaret had mentioned. It was a narrow stream, winding its way through the forest, its waters clear and fast. The air was warm now, the heat of the day pressing in on them. The creek was their first real marker on the path to freedom, but Clara knew it was only the beginning. Margaret looked at Clara, her expression serious. "From here, you'll need to cross the river to the north. There are safe houses along the way, places where people who believe in freedom will help you. You'll be fine." Clara didn't feel fine. She didn't feel anything but fear and uncertainty. The road ahead was long, and the dangers were many. But as she looked at the creek, the water rushing past her feet, she felt something inside her stir, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "You'll be fine." Clara stepped forward, feeling the cold rush of water against her ankles, and took the first step across the creek. She was still unsure of what lay ahead, but she was sure of one thing. She would keep walking. The world beyond the plantation was vast, but it was hers to claim. Freedom was within her grasp. Clara's feet were sore, and her body ached from the long journey. The trek through the forest had been exhausting, and though she had made it past the first set of dangers, she knew the road ahead would be filled with more challenges. The sun was now high in the sky, casting an oppressive heat over the land, but Clara's determination was unwavering. She had crossed the creek, and now the only thing standing between her and the promise of freedom was the treacherous path north. The river ahead was wide, but Clara knew it was the only way out of the woods. She had to reach the other side, where she could find a safe house. Margaret had explained the way, vague but enough for Clara to understand. It was a path that had been traveled by many before her, runaways and freedom seekers, but it was also a path filled with danger. By late afternoon, Clara found herself standing at the edge of a small clearing. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of a house, tucked away in the woods. It wasn't much, just a small, modest cabin, but it was a sign that she was on the right path. This was the first safe house, one of the many secret places that had been established along the way for people like Clara. The house was isolated, hidden deep in the woods, and its inhabitants were known only to those who were desperate for freedom. They were strangers, but in a world where trust was a rare commodity, they were also her lifeline. Clara hesitated for a moment, wondering what kind of people would be living in such a place. But she knew she had no other choice. If she didn't seek refuge, she would have nowhere to turn when the sun set. She took a deep breath and walked up to the door, knocking twice. The sound echoed in the stillness of the forest. The door creaked open slowly, and a woman appeared, her face partially shadowed by the dim light inside the cabin. She was older than Clara, her face lined with age, but her eyes were kind, full of understanding. For a moment, Clara simply stared at her, not knowing what to say. She had heard stories about people like this woman, who risked their lives to help slaves escape, but Clara had never met one in person. The weight of the situation hit her suddenly, and she found it hard to speak. "Come in, child," the woman said softly, her voice warm but firm. "You're safe here for now. I've been expecting you." Clara stepped inside, her heart still racing from the journey. She glanced around the cabin, which was sparsely furnished but cozy. There was a fire burning in the hearth, and the scent of something cooking lingered in the air. The woman led Clara to a small chair near the fire, where she could rest. "Are you hungry?" the woman asked, already moving toward the stove. "I've got some stew brewing." Clara nodded, her stomach growling at the thought of food. She hadn't had a proper meal in days, and the promise of something warm and filling was irresistible. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, her voice shaky, as Clara sat by the fire. The woman served her a bowl of stew, and they ate in silence. The fire crackled, filling the small cabin with warmth, but Clara's mind was racing. She had come so far, yet she was still so far from being truly free. The road ahead was still fraught with danger. The woman noticed Clara's discomfort and offered a reassuring smile. "The journey you've taken is long, child, but you're not alone. Others have walked this path before you. You're safe here for tonight, and tomorrow I'll help guide you to the next step." Clara looked up at her, unsure of what to say. The woman's words were kind, but Clara knew that the safe house was only temporary. She couldn't stay forever. "I'm not sure what comes next," Clara admitted. "I don't know where I'm going after this." The woman nodded, her face softening. "You'll make it. You're stronger than you think. There's a place up north near the river. They'll take you from there, but it's a hard journey. You'll have to cross into more dangerous territory, but there are people there who will help. We're all just part of something bigger." Clara nodded, her mind filled with images of the life that awaited her. The possibility of a home, a life outside the plantation. The promise of freedom was real, but so were the dangers. That night, Clara lay awake in the small bed, staring up at the ceiling. She could hear the wind rustling the trees outside and the faint hoot of an owl in the distance. The cabin was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, as though the weight of her escape was pressing down on her. She thought about the family she had left behind, her mother, her sister, the friends she had known in the fields. They were still there, on the plantation, still trapped in the life she had just escaped. The guilt of leaving them behind gnawed at her, but she knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't give up the chance at freedom for their sake. If she did, she would never be able to live with herself. But as Clara lay there, the uncertainty of the journey ahead clouded her thoughts. She had crossed the plantation gates, but the road north was long, and she didn't know what dangers awaited her. By dawn, Clara was up and dressed, ready to continue her journey. The woman had given her a few more supplies, and with a steady hand, Clara packed them into her satchel, feeling the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The woman walked with Clara to the edge of the cabin's clearing. "The road ahead will be harder. You'll need to cross through the woods and past the river. After that, you'll be safe," she said, offering Clara a final, understanding look. Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you. I'll make it." The woman gave her a smile that was both sad and proud. "Good luck, child. You're free now, and don't ever forget that." With that, Clara turned and walked into the woods, her heart filled with the heavy weight of freedom and the unyielding determination to make it to the end of the road. The forest was still and heavy with silence as Clara continued her journey. The wind rustled the leaves above, but the world around her felt unnervingly quiet. She had been walking for hours, following the trail Margaret had described, but her legs were weary, and her mind was clouded with uncertainty. The morning sun had risen, but Clara could already feel the oppressive heat of the day pressing down on her. She longed for the cool shade of the woods, but it seemed to be slipping away, replaced by the open, exposed terrain ahead. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "Once you reach the river, there's a safe house. But until then, it's all on you, child." Clara had learned quickly that the journey was not just a physical one. It was also a mental battle. Every step forward was a risk. Every sound in the distance was a threat. She had made it this far, but Clara knew there was no such thing as safe on this path. Even in the woods, surrounded by trees and shadows, there was danger. Clara had crossed another small creek, hoping to rest for a while, when she heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes nearby. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was too deliberate, too close. Someone or something was moving in the brush. Clara's instincts told her to run, but she held her ground, her body tensed like a coiled spring. The noise stopped. Then, to her horror, a voice called out. "Who's there?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the voice of a slave or a traveler. It was the unmistakable drawl of a southern overseer. Her blood ran cold. How had they found her? Was it a patrol? Had someone already reported her disappearance? "Answer me!" the voice shouted, drawing closer. Clara moved quickly, ducking into a nearby thicket of bushes. Her heart pounded in her chest and her thoughts scrambled. She knew that if she was found, all of her efforts, everything she had risked, would be for nothing. She had to think, to act. But fear clouded her mind. The rustling grew louder as the man drew near. Clara held her breath, praying he wouldn't see her. She could hear his footsteps crunching against the forest floor, closer and closer until they stopped right by the bushes where she hid. "Must be a damn squirrel," the voice muttered, frustrated. "Could have sworn I heard someone." Clara's body was frozen, her chest tight with the effort to remain quiet. She could feel every beat of her heart as if it was echoing through the trees. The man was only a few feet away, and if he turned, he would see her. But just as quickly as the tension had risen, it began to fade. The man muttered something unintelligible and moved away. Clara didn't dare open her eyes until she could no longer hear the sound of his footsteps. She waited, her body still, for what seemed like an eternity. When she finally allowed herself to breathe again, the forest felt even quieter than before. The rustling of leaves seemed to stretch out into the distance, and Clara's heart rate slowly returned to normal. Clara didn't know how much longer she could keep going. She had narrowly avoided being caught, but there were still miles to go before she reached the river. She had to push forward. The thought of freedom pushed her onward, but the fear of being discovered haunted every step she took. She took a moment to gather herself, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. There was no turning back. The decision had been made, and Clara was not going to stop now. Her mind drifted back to the memory of the plantation. The overseers, the endless work in the fields, the beatings, and the loss of so many people she had known. Friends who had never escaped. family who had stayed behind, still trapped in a life of misery. They couldn't run. But Clara could. She had to. She had never thought of herself as a fighter, but today she understood the true nature of survival. Every day she fought to endure. Every moment she fought to keep her spirit alive. She had been a slave, but she would not die a slave. Freedom was within her grasp, and she wasn't going to let fear take it away. As Clara pressed on, she could feel the sweat dripping down her neck. The forest had given way to a more open stretch of land, and the further she went, the more exposed she felt. The path ahead was clearer, but it also made her more vulnerable. There were no trees to hide behind, no shadows to slip into. Then she saw it, a plume of smoke rising in the distance. At first, Clara thought it might be a campfire, maybe a group of travelers. But as she drew closer, she saw men gathered around it, talking in low voices. There were at least 5 of them sitting by a fire, their backs to her. The distinctive shape of rifles leaned against the logs they were sitting on. Clara froze. These weren't just ordinary travelers, these were bounty hunters. She had heard stories about them. They hunted runaways for money. They were ruthless, and their job was to catch people like her. There was no way around them. If they saw her, her chances of survival would be slim. Clara's mind raced. She could see the river in the distance, just beyond the men. If she could make it to the water, she might have a chance. But she couldn't walk openly past them. It was too dangerous. There was only one option left. She had to hide. There was a large rock formation up ahead, and Clara quickly made her way toward it, crouching low and moving as silently as she could. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hid behind the rocks, her breath shallow and quick. The men were too close. She could hear them laughing, talking. One of them was sharpening a knife, its sharp sound cutting through the stillness of the air. Clara held her breath, praying that they wouldn't hear her. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. Then, finally, the men began to move. One by one they rose, leaving the campfire behind. The sound of their footsteps faded, and Clara allowed herself to breathe again. She stayed hidden for several moments longer just to be sure. When she was certain they were gone, she rose slowly from her crouch and continued on her way. As Clara neared the river, she could feel her legs beginning to ache from the long journey. She was exhausted, hungry, and scared, but the thought of what lay ahead, the possibility of freedom, kept her moving. She knew that every step brought her closer to the life she had always dreamed of. The river was just ahead. Clara could see the water sparkling in the dim light, the sound of the current growing louder as she approached. But as she neared the edge of the bank, Clara stopped. The sight of the river was both a relief and a new challenge. The crossing wouldn't be easy. The current was strong, and the water was cold, but Clara had no choice. She took a deep breath and stepped into the river, knowing that she had crossed another threshold. She was no longer just running. She was fighting for her future. Clara stood at the edge of the river, staring at the swiftly moving current. The water glittered in the dim light of the early evening, its cold surface a reminder of the final obstacle she had to overcome. The river was wide, far wider than she had expected. The thought of crossing it, alone and without help, filled her with dread. The current was strong, powerful, and Clara knew it would be a struggle. She had no choice, though. The freedom she had fought for was just on the other side of this river, and the road to it was full of risks, but it was one she had to take. Taking a deep breath, Clara waded into the water. The cold hit her like a shock, sending a shiver through her body. She gasped as the current tugged at her legs, but she pressed forward, determined not to turn back. Her shoes, long discarded on the shore, had been left behind in the haste of escape. The jagged rocks beneath the water threatened to trip her, but she kept her footing steady, each step forward a small victory. The sound of the river was deafening, its rush drowning out everything else. The water came up to her waist now, and Clara could feel the weight of it pulling at her. The river was more than just a physical barrier. It felt like a test, a final judgment on whether she would make it out of this life or be swallowed back into the chains of the plantation. Every inch she moved forward felt like a battle, but Clara refused to stop. Just as she thought she might be halfway across, Clara lost her footing. The current slammed against her, pulling her toward the deeper part of the river. Panic surged through her as the water hit her chest, and for a moment she feared she might be swept away. Her body flailed and she struggled to regain her balance, but the water was unforgiving. Clara gasped for air, her body pushed and pulled by the water. She was sinking, slipping under the surface, but she forced her feet to find the bottom again. The cold made her muscles feel stiff and her limbs burned with the effort to stay upright. She tried to reach for the bank, but the current was too strong and her vision blurred as the water splashed against her face. Just as she felt the panic begin to overwhelm her, Clara saw a rock ahead. It was large enough to give her something to hold on to, and with the last of her strength, she pushed toward it. Her hands gripped the smooth surface and she pulled herself up, coughing water from her lungs. For a moment she simply rested there, letting the river rage around her while she caught her breath. The sound of her heartbeat was loud in her ears. She hadn't realized how close she had come to drowning, but the fear of it now seemed to settle in her bones. She had made it this far, but the river had almost claimed her. With trembling hands, she pushed herself to her feet, determined to keep going. The river was not going to stop her. Nothing was. After what felt like hours, Clara finally made it to the far bank. Her feet slipped on the muddy edge of the river, but she managed to scramble onto solid ground. She collapsed onto the earth, the exhaustion of the day and the near drowning overwhelming her. For a moment she lay still, breathing heavily, her body aching from the strain. The sound of the river was still ringing in her ears, but now she could hear the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds overhead. The night was creeping in, and the darkness of the woods pressed around her. Clara knew she couldn't rest for long. She was exposed here, and although she had crossed the river, she was not yet safe. There were still miles to go before she reached the next safe house. The bounty hunters were still out there. The overseers would come looking for her. Clara staggered to her feet, wiping the wet hair from her face, and began to walk again. The path ahead was rough, with brambles and roots threatening to trip her, but she didn't stop. The pain in her legs, the cold in her bones, none of it mattered. Every step she took brought her closer to her freedom, and she wasn't about to let anything stop her. As Clara moved deeper into the woods, she began to hear the unmistakable sound of horses again. Her stomach twisted into knots, and the fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind surged to the surface. She had crossed the river, but the pursuit was not over. The danger was still real. She quickly ducked behind a tree, pressing her body flat against the rough bark. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Clara's heart raced as she peeked out from behind her cover. A group of men on horseback were riding through the woods, their lanterns swinging from their saddles. They were looking for her, she knew it. The fear that had once felt distant now felt suffocating. Clara's mind raced. She could hear their voices in the distance, their conversation muffled by the thick underbrush. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more, and they were getting closer. The closer they came, the more certain Clara became that she wouldn't make it past them. The woods were dense, but not dense enough to hide her forever. Her thoughts flashed back to the cabin, to the safe houses, to the people who had helped her escape. She had come so far, and now it seemed like it might all be taken from her in an instant. But she wasn't going to give up now. She couldn't. Clara's eyes darted around, and her gaze settled on a thick patch of bushes several yards away. It wasn't much, but it was something. Without thinking, she ran for it, moving as quickly as her tired body would allow. She dove into the brush, pressing herself flat to the ground, her heart thundering in her chest. She didn't dare breathe. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt like it might betray her. The riders came closer, their voices now clear and distinct. Clara could hear the leader's voice barking orders, his tone harsh and demanding. "Search the area! We can't let this one get away." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The men were just yards away, their horses slowing as they neared the patch of bushes where she lay. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, praying that they wouldn't see her. The seconds stretched on like minutes. She could feel the heat of the lantern light on her face, and the sound of the horses' hooves was deafening. But then, nothing. The men moved on. The brush shielded her, and for a moment, Clara's body stayed frozen, as if any movement would betray her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the riders faded. Clara let out a shaky breath, the tension in her body releasing. She had survived for now, but she knew she couldn't rest. Not yet. Clara waited until the sounds of the riders had completely disappeared before she carefully rose to her feet. Her legs were stiff from the cold, and her heart was still racing from the close call, but she kept moving. The darkness of the woods surrounded her, but Clara knew she had to keep going. She had come this far, and she couldn't stop now. The night had deepened, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and wet leaves. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Clara was no longer afraid. The river had been a test, and she had survived it. The hunters had come close, but she had evaded them. Her freedom was just within reach. And no matter how many obstacles she faced, no matter how many dangers lay ahead, Clara was ready to face them all. The night had settled in completely, a deep darkness swallowing the woods around Clara. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light she had to guide her was the faint glow of distant stars and the occasional flicker of a firefly in the underbrush. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and though her muscles screamed for rest, she kept moving. She had crossed the river, evaded the bounty hunters, and survived the wilderness up until this point. But Clara knew her journey was far from over. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, and every noise in the distance could signal another threat. But with each step, Clara felt something inside her harden, something that whispered that she could make it. She had come too far to give up now. As Clara continued through the woods, her steps became more cautious. The last few hours had been quiet, but the silence made her even more alert. The dark woods stretched on endlessly with no clear sign of where she was headed. She had been following vague directions given to her by the woman at the safe house, but now, in the isolation of the forest, it felt as though the trail was lost. The air grew colder as the night deepened, the temperature dropping significantly. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, the cold making it harder to focus. She had not eaten since the stew earlier that morning, and the gnawing hunger in her stomach was beginning to feel unbearable. But there was no time to rest. Clara had to keep moving. She needed to reach the next safe house, the one that Margaret had mentioned. But it was too far. The thought of walking miles more through the darkness seemed impossible. Her body ached from the journey, her feet raw and bleeding from hours of walking barefoot. Yet every time she felt like stopping, she thought of the life she could have, a life of freedom. And then, just as the weight of her exhaustion seemed unbearable, Clara saw it. Through the trees ahead, there was a faint light, barely visible but unmistakable. A lantern. Clara's heart leaped in her chest. Could it be the safe house? Had she finally made it? She took a deep breath and pushed forward, moving as quickly as her tired body would allow. She stumbled over roots and rocks, but she didn't care. The light was closer now, and with each step, her hope swelled. As she neared the clearing, Clara saw the silhouette of a small cabin. A single lantern hung by the door, casting a warm glow that made her heart race. She approached carefully, still cautious of the dangers that lurked in the night. She knocked softly at first, afraid that any sudden movement might alert someone to her presence. The sound of the knock echoed in the quiet woods, and for a moment, Clara felt a surge of doubt. What if this was a trap? What if this was a new danger, a trick to catch her? But the door opened slowly, revealing a man standing in the threshold, his face shadowed in the dim light. He was older, perhaps in his mid-50s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He wore the clothes of a farmer, simple but sturdy, and his expression softened when he saw Clara standing before him. "You're safe here," he said gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "I've been expecting you." Clara's legs nearly gave out beneath her as she stepped inside the warmth of the cabin. She couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over her. It was the safe house she had been searching for. The man introduced himself as Henry, a farmer who had been helping runaway slaves for years. He offered Clara food and a place to sleep for the night, understanding the dangers that lurked outside. Clara sat by the fire, her muscles aching as she took the first real meal she had eaten in days. The warm bread and stew filled her stomach, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara allowed herself to rest. But even as she ate, her mind raced. The thought of her family back at the plantation, the people she had left behind, filled her thoughts. She could not rest for long. Her journey was still far from over. Henry spoke of the next steps, how to get further north to the places where freedom awaited. There were more safe houses, more people who could help. But Clara knew the road ahead would still be filled with danger. She was not safe yet. "Tomorrow we'll start again," Henry said as he prepared a bed for Clara by the fire. "There are people waiting for you up north, but it'll be a journey. Clara nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She was close, but she wasn't there yet. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. There was too much at stake. That night, Clara slept fitfully by the fire, her body exhausted but her mind restless. The thought of her family lingered in her dreams. Her mother, her sister, the friends she had left behind. Clara wished she could turn back and bring them with her. But she knew that wasn't possible. They were still trapped, still slaves, and Clara's fight for freedom was hers alone. The journey she had started was just the beginning. She could not save everyone, but she could save herself. And in doing so, perhaps she could help others one day. Clara awoke early the next morning, the first light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. Henry had already risen, preparing the supplies for the next part of the journey. Clara didn't hesitate. She stood up, dressed, and prepared to leave. The road ahead was long, but it was one she was willing to take. She walked out of the cabin, a new sense of determination filling her as she stepped into the cold morning air. The world beyond the woods was waiting for her, a world where freedom could be hers. As Clara began her journey once again, the morning sun cast long shadows across the ground, marking the beginning of the next phase of her escape. She was no longer just a runaway slave. She was a woman on a mission, one step closer to freedom, one step closer to a life of her own. The road was still dangerous, and the freedom she sought was still far off. But with each step, Clara felt stronger, more certain that she was on the right path. The path to freedom was never easy, but it was hers to claim. And nothing, no danger, no obstacle, would stop her from reaching it.